Rupert is one of our directors, but he's also a director of C3IA, and he's going to talk to us a bit about some of the changes that are going on and the impact of those around cyber essentials.
Okie dokie. See screen okay?
Yep.
Okay, cool. So so first off, this isn't a huge detailed brief about cyber essentials. It's not new. We've been around for since 2014, but it is very much an update on current issues and also a little bit of a view from the sort of front line from my team who are doing this on a daily basis. As Jeff had said, I'm one of the directors of the cluster, but actually also director of C3IA Solutions. So let's talk just a quick intro about us, because actually we don't brief in this forum very often, and just set the context as to why we're in this space and the sort of range of experiences that we have. So we've been around about 15 years. Our roots are very much in defence, in communication systems, and this is still a core part of our business, but has broadened to sort of enabling digital transformation across defence in the wider sense. And we're also now active in AI in the military context as well, in terms of how that's going to help decision making on the battlefield and the like. Because of that sort of deployed systems perspective, they also needed security, and therefore the information assurance part, as it was called at the time, was pretty strong in our business, and that led us towards the NCSC and being one of the first 6 companies to become an assured provider as a consultancy from them. And because of those links into the MOD, that also led us to Cyber Essentials, because the supply chain requirements called DCPP, Defence Cyber Protection Partnership, built upon Cyber Essentials as one of the key requirements if you're going to take on contracts. So we came into that space because we had quite a good network within defence and have helped people be ready to continue their delivery or to take on new opportunities. And then broader than that, we're very strong in the sort of information governance and frameworks and assurance and accreditation space. And we've got a range of more technical services, as you'd expect, which are very much a growing part of our business at the moment. We've been doing Cyber Essentials since 2016. So we've seen it grow at quite a pace and seen those developments over time as well. So what am I going to do today? Well, I'm very aware of the audience that we've got here. So, this isn't a deep dive into Cyber Essentials. We all know what Cyber Essentials is, I hope, and certainly we will have talked about it many times over the past few years. And I'm aware that there'll also be other practitioners on the call too. So I don't intend to give the details of what it is, but if you want to discuss that, my contact details will be at the end and that of my team. So if you want to pick up with them, that's absolutely fine. So what I thought I'd do instead is focus a bit more on a few of the more interesting facts and some of the current issues that are facing the scheme. So the first thing is, we're now at 32,000 organisations that hold a current Cyber Essentials certification, which is a pretty impressive number compared to where we were 6 years ago. Albeit, when you think of how many small SME organisations there are in the UK, there's a huge opportunity still to go at if this really is going to become the baseline of cyber hygiene in the UK. It's also interesting that there's quite a good proportion of people now that want to do it just to generally improve security rather than purely because of supply chain requirements. And whilst the majority, I think, is still driven by that need, i.e. the must do rather than the could do, it is showing an awareness that people want to be more secure and see it as a necessary thing in their business. A couple of other interesting facts there around the fact that if you've done Cyber Essentials, well, you get some free insurance for small businesses as well, but you're less likely to make a claim than others. And that's, of course, because we know that Cyber Essentials is focused around those high threat, or very prevalent attacks, ransomware and credential sort of attacks and the like. And then IASME, the organisation that runs it on behalf of the NCSC, and the NCSC are constantly reviewing and updating that standard to try and keep it in pace with threat and technology. And so actually in the early years, the changes were pretty incremental and not really that significant. But last year, a large change came in and a new question set, which was called Evandine. I'm not sure whether they meant to follow like the STORM naming protocol, but it certainly had that impact a little bit with some businesses. Came into force, and it brought in a few real key changes that most of you may be aware of, but just to sort of go into the background. And it covered things which people have been tending to put out of scope of their organization, because Cyber Essentials initially really focused on network security. And so it brought cloud services in. We all use cloud services and multiples of cloud services in our businesses, from CRMs to accounting systems to expense systems and the like. And also particularly focused not so much around the security of those platforms, which obviously is a responsibility of the provider, but around our access to it and the vulnerabilities within that. And that led to the mandated use of multi-factor authentication across all areas of cloud services. And we all know the good reasons why. As a secure group here, we're probably all nodding sagely going, yeah, that's a brilliant idea. Why wouldn't you use MFA? Due to brute forcing and credential stuffing, which is very prevalent and still is. But of course, actually, from a business perspective, if you look at it in a different lens, that has a huge impact because you have to provide some other way for people to authenticate, and either potentially with cost in terms of new multi-factor devices, telephones and the like. And in fact, just this week, I've been issued a government laptop to do some work. They've got to give me a laptop now and an iPhone. So that cost is pretty huge for government as well. But in places like the education sector, that's been particularly challenging. When you think of a classroom full of pupils who don't have phones in school and need some other way to authenticate. And whilst there are a range of options open to schools, some of them can be done at an enterprise level. That too has been challenging. And sadly, we've actually seen some schools lapse their CE and just dealt with one who's come up for renewal following this standard, who said it's specifically because of this issue, which is a bit of a backward step in that particular sector, because my personal view is that it's better to have somebody who's partially passed than not doing it at all. So I'd be interested to know from the group here, whether they've got actually any sort of real life stories or evidence around that as well. NCSC and Department of Education know this is a big issue. They ran a trial over just about this time last year, actually just finished last March rather, to try and get 600 schools through the process. And so they're aware of the issue and looking at solutions, but it is challenging for schools at the moment. And then the other thing they brought in was to bring home working to scope. Obviously, COVID had accelerated that, but it was already really a bit of an issue beforehand. So that was a pretty big change, and they allowed a 6-month transition period for people to finish the previous question set before attempting this one. And so that was in June. So basically, by June this year, anybody who's renewing will have to have met those requirements. There will be no other way around them. This year, then, Montpellier was launched, and in fact, I think it was either yesterday or the day before. It's certainly now up on the IASB website and the blog and the NCSC website and the like, and it's certainly not as ranged as it has been in the past. It comes into force in April. So what are the key changes? More detail around the software and standards of your operating systems, of any commercial off the shelf, but including all your firewalls and routers as well. In some respects, it's a little less onerous because you don't have to put all of the types down, but just the actual model numbers, but they put some clarity around that. They put a lot more focus on asset management. They know that this cyber hygiene is really important because there's been a number of incidents which have been occurred because people have items which are still live. But that's interesting because it's moving a little bit from purely technical controls to a more governance perspective, and organizations will need to have some policy and approach around this. There's also more guidance around third-party devices. This has always been a grey area in Cyber Essentials, which is, well, what happens with people's own devices? Bring your own device. What different contexts might you operate in, particularly students and the like. And they've now created this little grid here, which tells you whether or not they would be in scope of your organization. The other thing is unlocking, a very relatively small issue, but there's a requirement that anything had to be wiped after 10 locks. I think it was 10. And that was a problem if you had a Samsung phone, because the minimum you could set is 15. And so they've just clarified that that's acceptable as long as you've set whatever the minimum is. And also more guidance on malware protection, and that a mechanism is active on all devices in scope. So that's now, not just your endpoint laptops, etc., any device at all that you're using in the scope of your organization. Oops, excuse me, I've gone a little bit too fast there. And then I think the last piece around that is, is also they've issued some documentary guidance around the perspective of IASME and NCSC on how Cyber Essentials sits with a new sort of zero trust approach to sort of network use and architecture, in which they see them as not being at odds with each other, although, as I said earlier, the background to Cyber Essentials was very much around network security initially. So looking ahead, where are we now? What things are going on? Well, NCSC and IASME are very focused on trying to bring sectors of industry and business and society that may be a little bit behind forward. And so there's been a number of centrally funded campaigns. So I mentioned there was an education one last year. There's now one currently running for SME and micro businesses in the charity sector and those that provide legal aid, because they know that they are not flush with resources, and therefore giving them some help. And that basically allows you 20 hours of free support. It will be funded by the NCSC to help you get towards Cyber Essentials. If you achieve Cyber Essentials, that's brilliant. If you don't, you'll still be improved. And that so that equates to about 3 days of consultancy, which these organizations can access for free. We are participating in that as a company and as one of the certification bodies. And IASME are providing people or organizations that are contacting them, but I happen to call out through LEPs, local regions, etc. And chambers of commerce and the like for organizations in our own region. So if you know one that meets those criteria and they're interested in having some support before the end of March, do point them towards me. I'd be willing, I'd love to talk to them. I think the other thing to note, which is just the other picture here, is how the pricing structure has changed for Cyber Essentials. So that first level certificate is a fixed price, and it shouldn't be any different than what you're seeing on this table. But it did change a little bit last year, because we realized that actually the complexity and size does take a bit more effort, but it won't take a rocket science to realize that nobody makes much money out of offering Cyber Essentials certifications. It's not quite, but it's almost a social responsibility task rather than a profit-making one. When you get to Cyber Essentials Plus, it is scoped a bit more, and you would pay what I consider normal consultancy charges, but even for the largest organizations, that's generally no more than around £3,000. The other thing that happened during COVID was an increase in remote assessment capability. So this has always been theoretically possible, but most organizations like to do the assessment on site. And certainly we still like to do that, because we think that you build a better connection with your client, you can have a better conversation, and you can help them out by looking over their shoulder and giving them advice on maybe fixing some of the simple things that otherwise might make them fail. Nevertheless, COVID drove a change in approach. So we've seen most organizations can offer some level of remote assessment now, which opens up to people where actually the price otherwise increases because you're paying for travel and time. The other thing that might open up in the future, and this is literally Rupert's thoughts, there's nothing written that I've seen, but actually the potential there for you to have your C+ in an ongoing compliance model rather than a snapshot that we look at once a year. If you're going to put agents out in the network, albeit on a sample of devices, you can sustain those for a relatively little cost compared to some other options, and maintain at least a good visibility of your Cyber Essentials controls. I mean, I think that's an option for organizations to think about, whether they'd like to do that anyway, but also potentially it could be something that central government and IASME perceive would be good to do in the future. So we'll see how that develops. That's what I wanted to cover, really. As I say, that there is a lot of detail around that, and all the certification bodies have been issued now the latest guidance on what operating systems and standards, etc., are acceptable. If anybody wants to talk about those, I've got a little bit of that information available. Anybody's got any other stories or experiences that they've had from Cyber Essentials or any of the issues I've faced or sort of commented on, please bring them up. If anyone wants to contact me or my team, those are our email addresses. Please do get in touch.